Welcome to podcast number 1 in our series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In this podcast, we'll take a look at such questions as what made Europeans come to North America in the first place? And where does the word America come from? And was Columbus really trying to prove that the earth was round? Well, the story goes like this. During the Crusades, Europeans became accustomed to luxury items from the Far East, things like silk and porcelain and especially spices. However, after the Crusades, there was no direct trade route to the Far East, at least not over land, and hostile nations were in the paths of those trade routes, especially the Turks, not to mention the fact that Asia was a long way away, 6,000 miles. So if Europeans ever wanted to trade with the Far East, they would have to do so by sea, not by land. Portugal led the way by sailing south and west around Africa. By the 1490s, Portuguese ships had rounded the southern tip of Africa, called the Cape of Good Hope, and were actually in a position to now start trading with India, which they did. Spain took a different approach. Spain listened to a young Italian mariner named Christopher Columbus. Columbus presented a different idea. He told the Spanish crown that he would sail due west into the Atlantic, something no one had ever done before, at least not that they knew of, at least not since the Vikings. Columbus had done quite a bit of research. He had read the accounts of Marco Polo and his adventure to China. And he'd also been careful to examine the Viking sagas without Leif Erikson. And we do know the Vikings set up colonies in what is today Canada and Greenland, and they're still there today in Iceland. However, Columbus didn't really understand how big the earth was. He had estimates based on these things that weren't always accurate. Like many people in Columbus's day, Columbus felt that the earth was mostly covered by land, not ocean. Of course, we know today the exact opposite is true. Nevertheless, the Spanish crown granted his request, gave him 3 ships and financed his voyage, and promised him that he would get a 10th part of anything that he found in terms of treasure if he could establish a trade route to the Far East. All the people who knew Columbus described him as fairly tall and somewhat a fair complexion and with blue eyes. One of his friends described him as having very red hair, although his son said that he had blonde hair that turned white by the time he was 30, after he was worn out from all his troubles and trials. Columbus left Spain August 3rd in 1492 to set out on this adventure. One of the funny things is he took an Arabic-speaking translator with him. At that time, Europeans, or many educated Europeans, thought that Arabic was the mother language of all other languages. So he figured if he ran into someone they didn't know how to speak to, so this Arabic translator would be able to speak to them. The first stop was at the Canary Islands off the west coast of Africa. Columbus took on supplies and got ready and then headed due west out into the Atlantic. While they were out in the Atlantic, they were encouraged because they occasionally saw flocks of birds. This voyage must have been difficult for his men on the 3 ships. Many of them began to be fearful they would never be able to return back to Spain. Many of them had never been away from land for so long. And to be honest, Columbus really miscalculated the size of the world. He didn't know that there were 2 continents, as well as a whole other ocean, the Pacific, which is even bigger than the Atlantic, between Europe and the Far East. Nevertheless, he went forward bravely, and his men too, but occasionally they were on the verge of mutiny. On about October 9th or 10th, about 3 months after they had left Spain, the men could go no further. Many of them were threatening to turn back. They were afraid they wouldn't have enough supplies to get back, to make it back home. Columbus had been lying to the men about how far they had gone, because once he passed the point of where land should have been, according to his estimates, he didn't want them to know that. He did talk to them, and they agreed they would go a few more days, and luckily for him, a piece of driftwood as well as flocks of birds encouraged them to keep going, and a few days later, October 12th, they first sighted land. Columbus and his men landed on an island that they called San Salvador. Today in the Caribbean, there's an island that still bears that name. There's still controversy about where he first landed, but it seems to match the description best of his descriptions of the island. And he ran into the friendly Arawak Indians. From them, he learned a couple of new words. In fact, he thought he had hit part of Asia, so that's why he called them Indians, which is a word we still use today. He noticed them sleeping in these strange hanging beds that they called hammockas, and that's where we get the word hammocks. And he also noticed many of them rolling up these big leaves and smoking them, calling them tobaccos. And of course, we're all familiar with tobacco today. That was the origin of those words. Just a note about the Indians that Columbus ran into. The first Indians that he met were the Arawak Indians. They were friendly and even helpful to Columbus, but that was not always the case. On some of his ventures, he ran into the hostile Carib Indians, from which we get the word Caribbean. The Carib Indians were cannibals who were known to raid Arawak Indians and take them captives and serve them as their food at some of their feasts. And some of the details in Columbus's journal are a little too grisly probably to talk about here, a little too graphic, but they weren't always friendly. After his first landing, Columbus spent several months exploring the Caribbean, what today is the Caribbean, especially a large island that the Indians called Colba, which we call today Cuba. And he would ask them about gold and silver and about the faraway places of the East, which none of them had ever heard of, but they kept pointing him in different directions. On Christmas Day, 1492, the largest of Columbus's 3 ships, the Santa Maria, ran aground or on a coral reef just off the north shore of what is today Haiti. He was able to salvage the wood from the ship, and they used it to build some buildings in a little settlement that they called Navidad in honor of Christmas, and there he left 39 men. That was the first European colony in North America. A few weeks later, Columbus sailed back to Spain to a hero's welcome, and of course it didn't take long before other explorers and adventurers began heading west to try and claim their share of what they thought was a voyage to Asia. They still didn't understand that they were not in Asia, that the North and South American continents were actually whole new lands they weren't aware of. Columbus died in 1506, just 4 years after his last voyage. He made a total of 4 voyages. He never understood that he had not hit Asia, but that he had landed in a whole new world. To keep the peace between Spain and Portugal, the 2 European naval powers at the time, they signed a treaty at Tordesillas in 1494. The Treaty of Tordesillas, as it's come to be called, drew a line 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands near Africa. Spain got everything west of that line, and Portugal got everything east of that line, which included what is today Brazil. That's why Brazil speaks Portuguese, because it was colonized by Portugal. And it also protected Portugal's sea route around Africa, which they were using to trade with the Far East. Another important adventurer was a man named Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci was alive at the same time Columbus was. He was able to show that the North and South American continents were new lands, that they weren't part of Asia. And it's because of this and because of his first name Amerigo that we get the name America. It stuck. So the American continents are named after Amerigo Vespucci. England and France took notice of this exploration and possible route to the Far East, and a man named Giovanni Cabotta, an Italian, who was anglicized to John Cabot, sailing for England, made several trips beginning in 1496. He was trying to find a northwest passage, meaning if he could go north and west of Europe around the northern top of the North American continent, it would be a very short journey, relatively speaking, to the Far East. During one of his trips, he never returned. We assume he must have died somewhere or his ship crashed. His son Sebastian then continued in 1508, particularly interested in finding the Northwest Passage. He sailed kind of between the area between Labrador, which is in Canada, and Greenland, but he never did find it. It's too ice-locked to get through. France was also interested in getting their share of whatever trade might come from the Far East. Another Italian named Giovanni Verrazzano, who was employed by France, sailed along the eastern seaboard of what would someday become the 13 original American colonies in 1524. While both France and England were interested in establishing trade with the Far East, they weren't in much of a position to do so, and they had to content themselves with simply exploring at first. You probably noticed that a lot of these explorers were Italians. Italy had a lot of great mariners at the time, but Italy was not a united country, so they weren't able to do much more than just trade, without any central plan or unifying goal. The last adventurer or explorer that I want to mention was a Portuguese man named Ferdinand Magellan. That's the way you say his name in Spanish. He sailed in 1519, And he was the first person, or at least his voyage was the first one, to circumnavigate the globe, although he died during the voyage. He proved that Columbus's estimate of the size of the Earth was wrong, that it was much larger than Columbus actually thought that it was. Spain was very aggressive in exploring and conquering the Western Hemisphere. They brought back an enormous amount of gold they had plundered from the Aztecs and from the Incans and the Mayans, the three great civilizations in the Western Hemisphere. It was only within a decade or two that Spain was able to conquer all these empires, although resistance lingered for a while in some spots. After the gold was brought back, Spain brought back even more silver. They found a huge silver vein in Mexico and literally a mountain of silver in Peru. In fact, they brought so much silver back to Europe that it caused inflation there. But Spain didn't just stop with North and South America. They pushed even further west across the Pacific and began sending galleons to the Far East, the Philippines and beyond, where they established colonies and bases and were able to tap into the wealth of the Far East. From their bases in New Spain, or what is today Mexico, they would send galleons north along the coast of California and then due west from there to the Far East. So with the gold and the silver, as well as the goods brought back from the Far East, Spain became an enormously wealthy empire in a very short amount of time. So while Portugal, and especially Spain, began setting up colonies and establishing wealthy, vast empires, the other great powers of Europe were not able to do much about it. They were too involved in internal problems or wars. But French, Dutch, and English did turn to privateering and piracy, and they were enormously effective at privateering and raiding Spanish shipping and possessions during the 1500s. And Spain had to adopt a convoy system at set times of the year. All their ships would go in big groups to try and protect themselves against piracy and privateering from these other countries. The English were particularly good at piracy and raiding. Famous sea dogs, as they were called, men like John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, Walter Raleigh, and especially Francis Drake, made fortunes not only exploring but plundering and raiding Spanish towns and shipping. Francis Drake is probably the most important and famous of these English privateers. Not only did he circumnavigate the globe, but he was also the most feared. In fact, the Spanish called him El Drake. And he was bold, sometimes to a point of fault. He actually raided Cadiz, a city within Spain's borders, which was maybe foolhardy since Spain was the world superpower at that time. As you probably have noticed, religion played an important role in politics back in the 1500s, both domestic and foreign. There was nowhere in 1500 that you could go in Europe where religion and state were not inseparably intertwined. And much of what went on, including the attacks and piracy and the battles, had religious undertones. Spain and Portugal were loyal Roman Catholics, and they spread the faith wherever they went. France, though while nominally Catholic, had a large Protestant population known as Huguenots, many of whom tried to set up colonies in the New World to flee persecution there. By the end of the 1500s, England was probably irreversibly Protestant, and many of her people were equally committed to her religion as were the Spanish and the Portuguese to Catholicism. Spain had successfully achieved what all European nations had hoped to do. She had found an ocean route to the Far East, bypassing the Turks, and in the process had conquered an enormous amount of land that no one in Europe even knew existed. And the financial rewards, at least at first, were enormous. If you were to look at a map of the Western Hemisphere for the year 1570, Spain controlled the vast majority of it. England did not even have a single colony anywhere in the Americas, yet within 2 centuries, England would replace Spain as a world superpower. For further readings on these topics, I recommend the following books: History of the Americas by John Francis Bannon, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, A Life of Christopher Columbus by Samuel Eliot Morison, Empires of the Atlantic World, Britain and Spain in America, 1492 to 1830, by J.H. Eliot, A Brief History of the Caribbean, From the Arawak and Carib to the Present, by Jan Rogozinski. Lords of All the World, Ideologies of Empire in Spain, Britain, and France, circa 1500 to 1800, by Anthony Pagden. The great music for this podcast was provided by Christina Pluhar and her ensemble La Arpeggiata.